On mic today, we have Ron Marz. How you doing, good sir?
I'm good. I'm doing like everybody else is. I'm just at home.
Yeah, we're all kind of in the same boat on that front.
Yeah,
Um, but
it's a little different for everybody else, but this is the same for me. This is what I've been doing for 30 years, sitting in my house making up things. So I almost feel kind of guilty about the fact that this is just standard operating procedure for me.
put you at an advantage. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I have had more than a few people contact me and say, "Hey, you do this work at home thing, right? How does that work for you?" So, yeah, I guess, everybody's got to get used to it.
Yeah, and I truly think that when all this is over, the world as a whole is going to look at this and say, how much can we do from our own homes? How much do we really need to make commutes and offices? And I know some people are going to need to do it, but quite as many as there was before.
Sure, I think it's going to be obviously in a lot of ways, it's going to be a different world at the other side. I think it's also going to depend on the people that like this and can do this.
Mm-hmm.
That's not everybody. I know certainly there are even artists and writers that I know that want to get up, leave the house, and go to an office, go somewhere that is a workspace instead of always being at work. It's a different kind of mindset, and if you're not comfortable with that, sometimes you got to get up and go somewhere else. I know a comic book writer who actually would get up, get ready, go out the front door of his house, go around to the back of the house, and go in a different door and go into his office because he needed that separation of work and home.
That makes some sense. Now, go ahead.
I was going to say, it doesn't make sense to me, but okay.
Well,
but whatever you need to do to be able to do this, it's not for everybody, I think. And certainly the fact that you don't see anybody else all day is not for everybody.
I mean, if my workspace is the workspace I'm looking at behind you there, which is a better library than my local comic book store has, I think I could manage that.
The sad truth is that most of that stuff doesn't get read. I mean, it has been read, but there's a whole pile on the floor that you can't see that is probably 300 hardcovers and trades, maybe 400 that I have yet to dig into, because when you do this as your job, you tend to spend the time working, not enjoying it as much as you should.
Mm-hmm. I always kind of wondered, if you get the job, you have to suddenly gear up on years, if not decades, worth of backstory and back material. And I know there are archives that exist, but how much time do you get just to actually, do they allot you to do that, or is you just on your own?
Zero. You get, when you do this, when you write comics, you're paid to write. You're not paid to research. You're frankly not even paid to rewrite. So you get paid by the page, and whatever you have to do to get that page is your own time and your own dime. It's not like when I take over, if I'm taking over a book that has years of continuity and a plethora of history to learn, it's not like I sit down and read every issue that's gone before. I know there are certainly writers that do that want to have everything, but I read enough that I make sure I understand the tone of the book. I make sure I understand what the heart of the book is about, but I don't need to know every detail of a story that happened in 1982, because I ultimately want to tell new stories, not make up stories about stories that were printed 25 years ago.
Fair enough. I guess then I should probably acknowledge right off the bat, I was a huge DC reader throughout the whole of the 90s.
Oh, good. Well,
so I'm very familiar with a lot of your work.
You're speaking my language then.
Yeah. And to people who aren't speaking this language, in the early 90s, there was a big shift to put Batman and Superman and Green Lantern through these big changes. And you were helming the Green Lantern story.
Sure. I was brought in to tell that Green Lantern story, actually. So, the big the big sort of watershed event was the death of Superman,
Mhm.
which was ultimately just a story. That's all DC viewed it as. Oh, we're gonna kill Superman. It wasn't an event in that sense. They were just telling a story, and at that time, there were 4 Superman monthly titles, so you got a Superman story every week, and all the stories were coordinated. So it's like reading a weekly Superman comic. Pretty great stuff, actually.
I agree.
I really really enjoyed that period. I actually got to write some of the Superman issues after the death of Superman, down the road to, kind of fill in and give the regular teams a spell. But I know I'm friends with a lot of the people that were working on the books at the time, and they didn't think it was going to be a big deal. It was just another Superman story. And by the time the word got out and it turned into this media sensation, it was a big deal. It was a media-driven sensation. So, and you had people that hadn't looked at a comic, much less a Superman comic, ever, maybe, or certainly since they were kids, hunting down that issue in comic book stores nationwide. So it quickly became okay, what do we do? What's the story that comes out of this now? And they kind of had to, scramble to make plans of what was going to come after that. And obviously you had 4 different Supermen come back from the grave, so to speak. And which one was the real one, and where was Superman? And it's a really terrific story. And obviously some of those elements have played out in animated films and Batman versus Superman film and the Justice League film. So the next one up was Batman, and getting his back broken by Bane, which was obviously in a movie as well. And then the next one up in the queue was Green Lantern, and the big difference is that the Batman and Superman stories were not permanent. Superman didn't stay dead. Batman's back didn't stay broken. When I was brought in on Green Lantern to remove Hal Jordan as Green Lantern and create a new Green Lantern, there was no back door. There was no oh, we're gonna roll this back in a year. As far as I was ever told, and as far as I ever planned, we were just replacing the main character, creating a new one, and that was going to be the book from that point on. And that's the way I stayed on the book for 7 years after we removed Hal Jordan in a story called Emerald Twilight and created a new Green Lantern named Kyle Rayner. Darryl Banks and I, he was the artist on the book, stayed on the book for 7 years, which is kind of an unheard of run at this point. That happens very rarely in comics these days. It was a little more common back then.
I love the story, by the way. I mean, I want to say that right at the record. And I'm surprised that era of comics and that story in particular, I was surprised that there were people that disliked it, because I had such a positive response from it. I've heard that people would be, and I'm not trying to pick on it, I'm just trying to, because when I read it, I thought you had a really great grasp on the character and a really great sense of how to move the events forward. And, go ahead.
Comic fans, if there's one thing comics fans hate, it's change. And the other thing that comic fans hate is if you don't change anything. So, you're as with anything, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Sure, there was a backlash. We were removing a long-standing character from the title and turning him into, if not an outright villain, certainly an anti-hero or an antagonist. And there was a segment of the fan base that was upset about it. That was to be expected. Certainly, I expected it. I didn't count on quite the backlash that we had. I didn't count on death threats being mailed to DC Comics, but we got some of those. But the sales went up. Sales went up a lot. And ultimately, comics are a business. Comics are, the publisher loves to create art, certainly, but you got to sell copies to keep creating art. So I always say comics is the shotgun marriage of art and commerce. So in the commerce sense, in the commercial sense, it was a success. Green Lantern was not selling great before we took over, and Green Lantern sold really well after we took over. So, and certainly a lot of that has to do with the shock of the new and the fact that it was a controversial storyline that got people excited and interested. I do feel like it was a gateway into the DC universe for people of the right age and maybe people who hadn't been reading DC books before. And that was certainly one of the ideas. I was new to DC. I had come over from writing at Marvel. I'd been writing Silver Surfer and Thor, and DC offered me the book, and I came over to do it. So for me, it was my introduction to the DC universe as well, as a writer certainly, and to a reader as a certain extent. I mean, I grew up as a Marvel kid. I grew up reading mostly Marvel books, except for Batman and some Superman and New Teen Titans and the Wolfman Perez era, which was one of my favorite books. So I was always kind of more drawn to the Marvel style of storytelling, which was your heroes were relatable and kind of had feet of clay, and that's what we tried to do with Kyle. Kyle was very much kind of patterned after the everyman archetype of Spider-Man, Peter Parker, where you would hopefully be engaged in his story, whether he was in the superhero suit doing superhero things, or whether he was trying to make his rent or get a date for Friday night, or whatever more mundane stuff was going on in his life. So that was really the model that I was pursuing, because I felt like if the editorial mandate was, okay, we're taking Hal Jordan out of the book, there was no sense in doing a character like Hal Jordan, to replace him. So Hal was very much a iconic character, very much drawn, no pun intended, very much drawn from the archetypes of the 60s. And Hal Jordan's a great character, but he's already a hero before he even gets his Green Lantern ring. He's a fearless test pilot. He is Chuck Yeager before he ever meets a dying alien and gets this ring that can do anything. So I wanted somebody to have to grow into the role of being Green Lantern, to not be a hero already and have to learn on the job how to do it. And that's really what we did for a good portion of the run, is try to grow Kyle's character slowly into being able to be part of that heroic lineage. That
I'm really glad you touched on that, because that was actually the one point I wanted to swing back to, is that everybody, the complaint that would get people most passionate was that Abin Sur chose Hal Jordan specifically to take the ring, and when it came time to give it to Kyle, it was like, you'll do. Hey, it was the first person there.
Got to be just a guy, right?
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Well, it was to me. I wanted the job to be overwhelming. I wanted the job to be something that, frankly, he couldn't handle, and that's really my sensibility as a storyteller and as a reader, even. And I've used this example before. Like I love North by Northwest. It's a great Hitchcock movie, but one of the reasons I really love it is because Cary Grant's character is not a secret agent. He's not a hero. He's just a regular guy who gets pulled into this situation that is completely beyond him, and he has to figure out, how do I do this? How do I survive? So to me, there's more dramatic juice there than if your main character is already a hero. If he's already Jack Ryan, say, in the Clancy books, if he knows how to do everything already, that's not quite as intriguing to me personally as showing your hero learning how to do this stuff.
And for the benefit of anybody who's younger than me considerably, who's looking at like the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie, in my childhood, Hal Jordan was portrayed as an older guy, somebody who had already been through the ropes many, many times. He got the Green Lantern ring at an older age, and I actually thought as a kid how cool it was that he had these gray streaks in his hair. It would be really cool if I had those, and time actually took care of that quite well.
It got all of us, didn't it?
Yeah, I actually do have the Hal Jordan streaks just by nature, but yeah, that really does work for me. Is that he was replaced by this very 90s, teen hero type character, which again just fits the time period perfectly.
Well, it was to me it was all about contrast, and certainly there were other Green Lanterns who had been in fairly important roles in the series as time went on. John Stewart, Guy Gardner, Alan Scott, who was the original Green Lantern from the 1940s. So there were other characters who had this mantle, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't going to be like any of them. That the character we were creating was going to be different enough that he could stand on his own and bring another flavor to the buffet table. Green Lantern is one of those franchises in comics that you get to pick your own. Pretty for the most part. Batman is Bruce Wayne and Superman is Clark Kent, and kind of there are very few sort of franchise level characters where you get to pick. It's usually a very singular entity. Even over on the Marvel side, okay, if you don't like Tony Stark, you can at least get James Rhodes as War Machine. But to a great extent, there's one at a time. And with Green Lantern, certainly there was one at a time when we were on the book with Kyle, because that was part of the plan was, okay, let's not have a 3,600 member Green Lantern Corps. Let's have one guy. Let's have one guy have to do the whole thing by himself. We were kind of given free rein to turn the franchise on its head, and we did. We weren't given, other than here's what's going to happen in Emerald Twilight, which was given to me as a page and a half of notes from DC editorial. There was no real cohesive, here's what you're going to do with the character, or here's what your character is going to be like. They really let us make it up as we went, and they really didn't pull us back into the middle of the road. We just we made up Kyle, we made up his background and the costume and all that stuff, and they just let us go.
That kind of freedom is intimidating and fun at the same time.
Well, it certainly wouldn't happen now, because
sure.
When we did this, these were just comics for the most part. There was some animation, and there were a couple of movies starting to maybe be done, but this was sort of pre-Marvel Cinematic Universe. This was not these were not multi-billion-dollar properties at that point. Now, of course, these are the Marvel and DC universes have been translated into cinema and onto TV, and they are literally multi-billion-dollar properties. So there's more than one person looking over your shoulder, making sure you're not breaking the toys that you've been given to play with. And I totally get that. I certainly understand it, and it's reasonable. It's the way the world works. 25 years ago when we were handed the keys to Green Lantern, they kind of let us do what we wanted to do.
And the time rolls on, the MCU becomes a thing, the dollars start rolling into the comic book industry like never before. And about that same time period, they start rolling back some of the changes that were made in the 90s. Do you have any feelings on that? Do you enjoy watching the ride like everybody else?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, the comics are different from the movies, are different from the TV show, is different from the animation. But it's all, to me, it's all worthy and it's all valid, and you get to pick what you like. I like everybody else, go to see I'm sort of stunned to be living in an era in which everybody across the planet knows who Thanos is. You know, I wrote Thanos in the first year of my career at Marvel. And Thanos was an awesome villain and remains an awesome villain. But, you know, unless you were the niche audience of comics and a regular comic reader, you had no idea who Thanos was. I mean, maybe some people who knew who Doctor Doom was, but and the Joker and Lex Luthor because they had been in other media previously. But Thanos, nobody knew who Thanos was. And now, you know, I did a convention appearance in Nairobi, Kenya last year, which is a fairly amazing thing in and of itself that I could get invited to Kenya to sign comic books. And there was more than one person walking around in a Thanos T-shirt in Kenya, and I'm thinking, man, the world has totally caught up to our little niche audience, and we are, you know, our culture is now the mainstream culture, which I think is great. It's the bigger the tent, the better off we are.
I'd agree with that completely. It's one of the things I've been trying to talk to as many of my guests about is that, you know, fandom at this point, now that we have the world's attention, should be about bringing in more people and being welcoming and saying, hey, if you like Kyle Rayner, that's great. And if you don't, we can find something you do like. We don't have to get people pitted against each other.
We've got, yeah, I mean, we live in an age where we can show anything that you can put in a comic. When I was growing up, and the first probably half of my career, or maybe even a little more, like if you wanted to show that stuff, if you wanted to show Galactus descending upon the Earth and starting to eat the world, you had to go to a Jack Kirby comic to get that. That was the only place you could get that stuff. Now, of course, with technology, with digital special effects, we can show anything in a movie that we can show in a comic. So on the one hand, that makes the comics a little less unique. It makes what we do accessible to everybody, which is ultimately a good thing. But you know, there's a bit of nostalgia for when comics was the only game in town if you wanted that stuff. So now it's it's a little different, but I think comics are still pretty far ahead of most other entertainment mediums in terms of imagination, in terms of the kind of stories we can tell, because ultimately comics is somebody making up ideas, somebody making those ideas real on a piece of paper or a digital screen, and in fairly short order it goes to you guys, it goes to the readers. That's a very direct pipeline right into the brains of the audience, and you can't do that with films, you can't do that with TV. It has to be a lot more people and a lot more money and a lot longer gestation time to make something that's going to go into a movie or a TV show. So I still feel in a lot of ways we're still ahead of the curve.
Yeah, and I never thought of it quite like that. But, you know, if you have a miss with the audience, if you write a comic and the story really turns a sour note, 3 months later you can write a different story, walk that back a bit, or maybe just write a better story, and the audience kind of forgives you. If you make a bad movie, you don't get another chance for 5-6 years sometimes.
Yeah, you know, in comics there's always one next month. Or sometimes even sooner. I think some comics are ramping up and delivering content even quicker, because we're kind of a binge culture now. Everybody wants everything at once. Yeah, I mean, I love movies, I love TV, I love novels, but I love comics more than any of them. It's still my, after 30 years, it's still my chosen storytelling medium, and certainly not the only one that I do stuff in, but I think it's still my favorite. That the fact that I can come up with something that exists only in my head, and it gets sent off to an artist, and the artist you know, the artist uses his or her skills and makes that thing real, makes that thing appear appear on paper or on screen, and we put it in front of the audience. That still is the most magical thing about this to me, is that moment when the art pages show up in my inbox. It's still the coolest thing, and the priceless aspect of this whole thing is that, man, the thing that only existed in my head up until this moment is now made concrete, is now made real in front of me.
And what I think is great about comics, what makes it work, at least for me, when I read a really great comic, I feel like the artist and the writer managed to put in just enough information to tell me just enough story that I could get what's going on, and then my imagination fills in the rest.
Yeah, you fill in the gaps. It's a little bit like alchemy. You know, the creative team comes together, and it's writer, artist, colorist, letterer, editor. You know, it's a fairly small group of people, and if everything's working the way it should, we make something better. We make something bigger than any of us could make individually. We pool our talents and come up with something that could not be possible if we were separate. I usually refer to it as it's like a basketball court, and you know, your starting five, everybody does something different. Everybody plays a different position, or a jazz quintet. Everybody's playing a different instrument, and everybody in that example is playing a different thing. I mean, they're playing different aspects of a song, or maybe sometimes playing completely different songs. And yet somehow it all comes together, and everybody gets their moment to shine, and everybody does their job, and everybody pulls together to make this whole that is greater. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So to me, that's, it doesn't always happen in a comic. There are plenty of comics where that doesn't happen, and it's just kind of an assembly line process, and you get it done and you move on to the next one. But man, when it works, it's just the best thing in the world.
Do you think the process has been made better or worse or faster or anything by the addition of technology since, I guess, that really started hitting in the late 90s?
Well, I think there's really two answers.
Okay.
Ultimately, no, because it's still about the talent. It's still about the talent of the writer, the artist, the colorist, and there's. It didn't matter if Jack Kirby was drawing with a warm Hershey bar on the back of a grocery bag. It was still going to be brilliant because it was Jack Kirby. The tools didn't matter. So on the one hand, no, it's about the talent of the people involved and how they work together. On the other hand, the technology allows us to do more, to some extent, to do it quicker, although we somehow still manage to fill up every moment of that deadline, and the book just skins off to press at the last minute anyway. But we find, I think the coloring now allows us to do things that we couldn't do in the past. The advent of digital technology allows us to do things we couldn't do in the past. The fact that everything is digital and we can swap files with the press of a button allows us to have a much wider talent pool. I am as apt to be working with an artist from India or Croatia or South America as I am to be working with a guy that's an hour away. The talent pool, especially the artistic talent pool, is so much wider and deeper now. I think that's a huge boon for the business, because we're getting a lot of different influences, we're getting a lot of different styles, and we're getting a lot of different voices telling these stories. So that, to great extent, is terrific. And I think one of the advantages that we have now is the medium is certainly continuing to evolve and continuing to grow up, and we are telling different kinds of stories. It's not just Marvel and DC stuff It's not just superhero stuff. You can find virtually any kind of story you want in the American market now. You can find horror, science fiction, crime, romance. To some extent, the market now looks like it did, more than 50 years ago before the great comics implosion and the congressional hearings that decided juvenile delinquency was due largely to comics, not kids being kids. So there's a much wider range of the kind of stories being told, which translates into a much wider audience reading comics. The comics audience we have now is much more diverse than I think ever before. Certainly age range, men, women, gay, straight. There's a comic for everybody out there now. And the comics are a lot more accessible now. You don't have to go search out a comic at your local comic shop if that's not your particular flavor. If you just want to go to an online source, go to Comixology when the new comics are released every week, get whatever you want at the press of a button. I think that's a huge boon too. And people that are not sort of superhero fixated and don't need to go to aren't going to the local comic shop to get their superhero fix every Wednesday, or I guess it's partially Tuesdays now too, as DC gets some books into stores early. I think all of this stuff pays dividends down the road. The wider audience that we have now will be the wider range of creators that we have in 10 years who are making their own comics. So I think it's just gonna, the seed has been planted and the tree has started to grow and the branches are reaching out, and we're getting more and more people. And as we get more and more people, the branches continue to grow, because the people that are coming in and, the people that the kids that are reading Raina Telgemeier stuff now are going to be doing their own comics in 10 years and stretching their limbs even further.
That's fantastic. Nothing makes me happier than going to, say, Kickstarter and seeing somebody launch a passion project to have it printed up, and it resembles nothing like a comic I've ever seen. And even if it's not something I want to read, I just like knowing somebody had the ability to say, I want a comic about this type of person. I've got an artist and a writer. I'm going to make it happen.
Yeah, and comics are ultimately a very simple medium. You can get together with a handful of people and make it happen. That's not terribly true for most other entertainment mediums, but comics are a very bootstrap, do-it-yourself kind of thing. And if you want to do it yourself and put it out as a Kickstarter, and you can make that happen. There are to that extent, there are no gatekeepers anymore. If you want to make a comic, go make a comic. Put it online, do it as a Kickstarter. You can get it in front of people. As long as you have the passion to make the thing and finish it, you can put it in front of the audience, and then it's about cultivating that audience so you can do it again.
You're mentioning a lot of the works of Jack Kirby, and your talks about collaboration, and I have to ask, are you familiar with the work of Pete Dore?
Oh yeah.
Okay, did his Stan and Jack comic? I mean, I had him on a couple episodes back. We had such a blast on that. That's the kind of thing that I love watching, that because it just shows that the fans' feedback becomes almost a vicious cycle that people just start creating literally out of the characters now.
Well, the stories of the creators, the stories of the founding of comics in the early years, a lot of that stuff is just fascinating. A lot of that stuff is like, you couldn't make that stuff up. People wouldn't believe you. You couldn't make up, two Jewish kids from Cleveland coming up with Superman and changing the world. Two teenagers who lived down the street from each other. That's, if I pitched that story to an editor, they'd say, that's not believable. Come up with something else. Mm-hmm. But literally, I was in Cleveland a number of years ago, and and went to visit the houses, went to visit the Superman house, the house where Superman was created, and look up at that, at that bedroom window and go, that's where it started.
Wow.
It's and it was, for me, it was kind of like walking on holy ground to a certain extent, because certainly my life, had Siegel and Schuster not created Superman, the world would obviously be a different place, and I would certainly be doing something different than what I am now. So I really kind of standing in front of that house, which is painted in Superman blue and red, and it's a private house. You can't go in it, but there's Superman curtains in the windows, and there's a placard out front on the fence with a Superman S symbol on it. It really did feel like kind of making a pilgrimage, and was really the biggest reason that I went, was I felt like I needed to go pay my respects to that house and those people for what they brought into the world, and how that changed the world, certainly for me personally, but for all of us.
Yeah, I remember when Jerry Siegel passed away, the tribute in DC, I'm going to forget the exact wording, but it basically just showed the Superman symbol and the phrase, "He taught us to fly." As that was the moment. I mean, there are characters like Peter Pan and whatnot who would fly, but that gave a whole different idea to the idea of a person literally having the abilities that nobody else did. And every superhero after that had some various spin-off of that concept.
Oh yeah, and certainly, what Jerry and Joe created was certainly derivative of other things, was derivative of John Carter to a certain extent, which is also one of my big influences as 12-year-old kid reading Edgar Rice Burroughs novels. I mean, everything stands on the shoulders of what came before, which is fine and lovely, I think, and particularly in comics. We talked about reading the continuity of issues that came before and all that. Certainly, I as a creator stand on the shoulders of everybody else that came before me, and people that came after me are standing on my shoulders to a certain extent. It's a long chain, and we pass it down through the generations. And I think I think that's a positive. I think that's one of the reasons that it still continues is that there's such a history of kind of respecting the stories and respecting the generation that came before you.
And to swing back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the show, that's why I can't get my head around the people who are just like, I didn't like this comic and everything's ruined. And it's like, yeah, but like everything has always been changing. The idea of refreshing these characters has been going on since the very first issue. If you don't like it, sit back and give it a minute.
Well, the old sawhorse is that, if you don't like something that happened in a comic, it's like Scottish weather, wait until tomorrow, it's going to be completely different. Ultimately, these are cyclical stories, and it's certainly superhero comics. The essence of this stuff is the illusion of change. I learned that from one of the first editors I worked for, is that superhero comics in specific are about the illusion of change, about showing the audience something that's earth-shaking and different, but ultimately you come back to square one all the time. Superman's dead, and then he's not dead. Batman is broken, and somebody else takes over as Batman, and then Bruce Wayne comes back and he's Batman again. This is all part and parcel of serialized fiction and stories that are essentially all middle. I mean, superhero comics in specific are all middle to a great extent. There's no, there's no last Superman story or last Batman story or last Green Lantern story. There's just the next story. There's, great stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Superhero comics, to a great extent, have a beginning and a middle. and they just keep going, which is okay, because we've had 60, 70, 80 years of middle. You can pick whatever you want. If you want Dick Grayson, aka Robin, aka Nightwing, as Batman, there are Batman stories with him in the Batsuit. If you want Bruce Wayne, well, we got plenty of Bruce Wayne as Batman stories. You can seek out your own flavor, and now with collected editions, with digital editions, that stuff's easily graspable. You can get a hold of most anything, certainly at the click of a button. When I was a kid growing up, when I was 9, 10, 11 years old or whatever I was, picking comics off a spinner rack at the local deli, if you didn't get the next issue of Avengers, well, it was gone, and there was really no way to get it. There were some maybe in the back of a comic there was an ad for Mile High Comics or something like that, or Heroes World, where you could buy some back issues. But to a great extent, comic book stores were not much of a thing. I certainly didn't know comic book stores existed until I was in college. I didn't know that was a thing. So as a kid, you just read what was available. You read whatever happened to be on the spinner rack, and if your favorite issue of Avengers or X-Men wasn't there, you picked up something else. And I think there was I've talked about this with some other pros and who had that same experience of not really having a comic store that they knew to go to, but just getting comics off the spinner rack or in a grocery store. There was a certain excitement to going to the store and not knowing what was going to be there. You hoped that the next issue of Avengers drawn by George Perez was going to be there, but if it wasn't, well, maybe you had to settle for an issue of Thor that had a Jack Kirby cover and John Buscema interiors.
I've always remembered being into comics, but I didn't really get into it until I was about 10, and I didn't hit a comic book store until a couple of years later. But I had ripped out the listings from the phone book of every grocery store and convenience store and any place that I thought would sell periodical literature, and I would just ride my bike in circles around town trying to find something. And like I said, sometimes you found it, sometimes you didn't. And it was years until I realized there was a place I could go to get the back issues. Always saw those ads for Mile High Comics. And the first time I went to Colorado, the only stop I could make that was like my choice, like we have to hit this place. I have to physically stand in that store because I've been seeing it in ads for 20 years.
You are not the first person to tell me that. It's ironically the morning before the coronavirus lockdown started to come. It was the morning before the NBA canceled its games, which was to me the big, like the first real this is a serious thing. When the NBA like clears guys off the court and says we're not playing anymore, that's when everybody stood up and take notice. I met a friend of mine, a guy that I coached Little League with. Our sons played Little League ball together, and he was a coach on the same team with me. And I hadn't seen him in a couple of years because our sons ended up going to different junior high schools and high schools. But he gave me a shout and said, "Hey, let's you're around, let's get together." And man, that's great. So we sat down at breakfast, and he told me about his pilgrimage to Mile High Comics, like a week or two before. He said, "Yeah, as a kid, I always saw those ads, and I would order some stuff from Mile High Comics." And he said I had to go to Mile High Comics, and this is the first time he and I had really discussed comics. I mean, he knew what I did, but we didn't really get into the weeds on any of it. But the place that he really decided he had to go was Mile High Comics, taking a business trip to Colorado, and he told me that the issue that he ended up getting at Mile High Comics was an issue of Swamp Thing by Bernie, and I said, you're a fan of Bernie Wrightson? He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, he was one of my best friends. He was like at my wedding. He was at my father's funeral. He's like, what, are you kidding me? So it's just, just so odd that we had never discussed it. And I'm like, yeah, I got I've got original pages of stories that I worked with Bernie on hanging in my office. I've got a painting by Bernie Wrightson in my living room. So it's odd, those things that, those points of connection. Like, here's a guy I've known since literally our kids were in T-ball, in minor league ball when they were 5 and 6 years old. Never came up. Bernie Wrightson never came up. Mile High Comics, none of it ever came up. And here we are literally 10 years later, and he's like, oh yeah, I got this Bernie Wrightson comic. Somehow a lot of people have some sort of comic that might not even realize, but the guy next to him has the same connection.
It's unreal. And those kind of stories, I would love to sit here and chat with you about that and have a whole episode about just that. And maybe we should set that up.
We can do that because frankly, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
we're going to be doing this for a while. So this is what passes for a social connection these days. And look, if that's the worst thing that's asked of us, I'm totally okay with that.
Agreed. Well, while we wrap this up, and maybe we'll pencil in something real soon, where can people keep tabs on your work and on your presence on the internet?
The easiest place is Twitter, where it's just @RonMarz. They can also go to ominouspress.com, where I am the editor-in-chief of Ominous Press and lead writer for a bunch of the stuff we do there. So I'm part of that publishing concern. And write some books, edit some books. I'm editing the Jim Starlin's Dreadstar Returns, which we're doing a Kickstarter for right now. And I say I'm editing Jim Starlin's book. Mostly what I'm doing is Jim sends me the pages and I go, that looks really good, Jim. Keep that up. He doesn't need me telling him what to do. And my website is @RonMarz, @RonMarz is Twitter. RonMarz.com is a website in serious need of an update, and there are Instagram and Facebook pages for me as well that I don't visit as often, but they're there. And if somebody wants to reach me through Facebook, it will eventually get to me as well.
All that stuff is going to be in the show notes on my website, aaronbossack.com. So if you happen to miss it or couldn't write it down, just go ahead and check that out. Ron, thank you so much, and I would love to have you back real soon.
Thanks, Aaron. It's a pleasure. We will do it again. We have many opportunities.
Indeed. Take good care. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.